Welcome to Uncomfortable, conversations about culture and Christianity. My name is Eric, and today I'm joined by Jess.
Hello, world.
And Alex.
Gobble, gobble, one. Gobble, gobble, two. You guys heard that song?
I haven't.
Like Matthew West.
Oh, no.
Is this like a follow-up to the cartoon song?
No,
That's
it's
what I
a
was
song.
thinking.
It's kind of probably that feel, but it's a song called Gobble, Gobble. You'll have to look it up. I wish
These are the
I
songs
didn't have my
I can't get all the way through
Bluetooth
if they give
privileges.
me
privileges revoked by Austin.
Producer Austin.
Producer Austin.
I've done some things the past few weeks, some transgressions where I played things through my computer, noises and sound effects.
Okay,
where he
but
doesn't let
all
me.
appropriate. It's like zoo animals.
Yeah.
I know. One was like, wah, wah, wah.
Yeah. So he lost his privileges.
You're done.
So I would play you
Cut
the
off.
song, and YouTube would not like it, probably, but
So today's Black Friday.
it is.
The blackest of Fridays, the day after Thanksgiving. We're all very full right now. We just ate big turkey meals. I just
Food
heated up a
coma.
turkey sandwich.
Depending on, I guess,
leftovers.
what time people listen. I think we have some midnight listeners.
Yeah.
Oh yeah,
Probably.
Yeah.
If you're a midnight listener,
that's true.
let us know.
Hey.
Yeah, comment right now on YouTube
What time
if
you're
you're
listening.
a midnight listener.
Yeah. Yeah. And it is helpful, honestly, if you are commenting on YouTube, to let us know maybe like a timestamp or something, because sometimes it's hard to follow up with when.
Yeah, what you're responding
if they
to.
comment,
No,
doesn't it
No,
give
it
the date
doesn't.
and time?
Well, no, he's
No, it
meaning
gives
in
us
the
date.
video. Like if they're watching, like, are you
Oh.
watching 10 minutes and 12 seconds into the video?
Yeah.
Or,
Sometimes it doesn't always correlate. So I'm like, what?
yeah.
What did that comment relate to? Because I don't remember.
Yeah.
So anyway.
Well, with Black Friday upon us, is there any participants here around this table?
I've been a Black Friday participant for
Do you get in line and
Yeah.
run over small elderly
Yeah.
people?
And normally
stampede?
I just go for the fun. I
Yeah.
don't have like necessarily something I'm going for.
Yeah.
My sister and I have just always gone.
Yeah.
I just want to beat Iowa today. That's all I want is Nebraska to finish
It's
their
been a while
season with
since
a
you've
win.
brought, something back to
I'm
Nebraska.
excited to hear what happens in the coaching, with Nebraska and the future of the Cornhuskers.
Yeah.
More excited than I've ever been.
Okay, do you do Black Friday shopping, Eric?
No, I would say years ago I would get a little more excited about that. But if I'm being honest, it's because I used to buy a lot more like physical media, like DVDs
Beanie
and
Babies.
video
Yes.
games. Like,
Yes.
but now everything's digital, so I don't
You're
really
just like, what's
find the appeal.
why?
I mean, if you really need a TV, I have bought a TV on Black Friday a couple different times,
Yeah.
but it's not like I've raced to the store and fought for it.
DVD player. I got a DVD player.
Yeah, a
Yeah.
Blu-ray player, an air fryer. Is that when you got your air fryer?
Air fryer.
No, my mom bought us the air fryer.
Oh, she probably got it on Black Friday.
I hope so.
It saves some money. Yeah, not as much though anymore. There's the Cyber Monday that's in a few days, and that one sometimes. But it just all seems like a gimmick at this
I
point.
mean,
so.
really,
It's a
there's
Black Friday a day deal at Walmart. They send it like every day. There's a new one or Prime,
Yeah.
and everybody has.
it's already happening.
I'm just glad a lot of businesses decided to give their employees the day off yesterday. That seems like a new trend that's slowly been building over the years, and now you're seeing more and more people jump on that,
Yeah,
which is kind
because
of
Black Friday was starting to creep. Like I remember for so many years
before the
into
pandemic.
Thursday.
Yeah, like it was like
just taken over.
Black Thursday, pretty much.
Yeah.
I will say that with all the online shopping that happens, and we have people send us lots of things, I do put out some snacks and drinks for the delivery men.
Oh,
So if
that's
you've never
nice.
done that, it is a simple way to
Just like a
love
basket
people.
or something, and say, take.
Just some
delivery.
snacks,
Hey,
some
delivery
different drinks,
person.
and then I'm like, thanks for delivering our packages.
Just in the holiday season, or is that something you do year round?
No, just holiday season, because it's like you feel like
Busier.
they're so busy too. So
Yeah.
That is
put some
that
beef
makes
jerky
sense.
out there, whatever you want.
What would you like if the listeners were going to get you something on Black Friday for Christmas? What would you like them to get you?
I don't know. I've been looking at air fryers now that we're talking about it.
Air fryer.
I don't have one yet. I
I
feel
know-
like I'm behind.
I know which one you should get, but I feel like it's a weird like product placement if I say
Okay, you
the
might tell me
brand,
later.
but I'll tell you later. And if you want to know, you can email the
Well,
podcast and
but
I'll
if
answer
somebody's buying it for me, maybe they should know the best
you.
one.
Yeah, but there is one that is like I would personally think is the It's the best.
I'm
I
easy
really
to
enjoy
love, you
my
know.
air fryer,
Just
but I also won't say it because of the same.
Yeah.
If they
Why
would
is it
sponsor
a-
us, then
Yeah.
oh, got it. We're
for
not
sure.
giving.
Yeah,
it
we're not
out?
giving free.
Giving out.
You know how many people listen to this? How much
Oh,
money they would
yeah.
make if we
Okay,
dropped
so
their
what do
name?
you want somebody to buy for you?
Oh man,
What would you like us to tell Aaron that you want?
Even all the discounted Yeezys.
no, I don't even know. It's so funny, like the things that
just
at
got
this
that.
age you're like, I want for Christmas.
Yeah.
I think we're like we need nicer new
Yes.
sheets.
I know,
Can we get
right?
some
It's practical.
towels?
Yeah,
It's
practical
not like,
stuff.
Yeah. Like my mom's like, what do you want? And that's like why she got us an air fryer. One year it was like a vacuum, you know, it's
Yep.
like those maybe bigger
practical
purchases
gifts.
that you're not always getting. But I mean, I'll drop it. If someone would like to buy me the Ultra Apple Watch, it's something I'm not going to spend my own money on. But if you're feeling generous,
You want to go hiking in the mountains and
Yeah.
really have something rugged.
go ahead and send it to me.
All right. Well,
Drop
yeah.
it off at the church.
Yeah, and I'll take a Tesla. All right, so while we're asking for Christmas gifts, all right, that's great. Enjoy your Black Friday. Up next, Alex, you got an opportunity to sit down with author Jay Kim. This is a video interview over the internet. That's how we did it. But he's the author of the book The Analog Christian, and if you were to just set this up a little bit for people, what would you give them without giving it away too much?
No spoilers.
Yeah, so we're in the middle of a series at the church talking about digital. You know, it starts this Sunday, the digital landscape of our soul, and so he really talks a lot about cultivating contentment, resilience, and things like that throughout his book. In a world where, you know, we're constantly being nagged or buzzed with our devices, and so it just talks about how do we live as Christians faithfully in this new space. And analog, I mean, I would say the title's maybe not directly all he's talking about, because this definitely isn't a guy that's like, never use the internet, because we just did a interview over the internet.
Yeah.
And so, recommend it.
All right, stay tuned for that.
Today we've got Jay Kim on the podcast. Just to kind of give everybody a brief rundown, we're in the middle of a series talking about just digital discipleship and how it affects our souls. And Grace, who is one of our admins here, heard Jay on the Holy Post having this conversation. She's like, "You need to get this book. You need to read it before we have that the series brainstorming and all that." And so I read it and just on a whim reached out, and here we are. So thank you, Jay, for being here and for writing this book, and for saying yes. I've noticed as I just creeped on you a little bit on social media and YouTube's, man, your willingness to do this, to jump on with people and to use, your gifts and whatever the word is, platform, to have these conversations. It's rare, unfortunately, sometimes in ministry circles. So thank you for your time to jump in and dive into the conversation.
No, yeah, it's an easy yes for me. It's a joy. So thank you for asking.
Cool. Well, just to introduce you a little bit, you just want to talk about yourself a little bit and who you are, and maybe why this became like an interest point for you.
Yeah. My name's Jay. I'm a pastor in the Silicon Valley of California, kind of just south of the San Francisco area. And I've been here most of my life. I wasn't born here, but I moved here when I was really young. So this being Silicon Valley, and it wasn't what it is now when I was growing up in the mid to late 80s and 90s, but it was still in many ways at that time one of the hubs for computers and digital technology. I remember my uncle for many years worked at IBM, which was right here. And so and then over the course of having spent almost 40 years of my life here, I I've watched, the expansion and the proliferation of, startup culture and digital technology, and how sort of, this is the epicenter for all of that. So our church is like 7 minutes from the main campus of Apple. So we have a significant percentage of our congregation. They either work at Apple, or they've got some 1 or 2 degrees of separation removed from someone who works at Apple. Half the guys in my small group work at Apple. We always joke about that. So I've just been surrounded by it. And then as a follower of Jesus, and as a pastor who really cares about serving and shepherding a community of people that I feel really called to, it's just sort of an undeniable reality of our life, and something that's so front and center for me that over the course of the last several years, I've just I've had to sort of sink deeply into these ideas because they were so I was confronted by them in so many ways. So one, in my own personal life, just my own wrestling and reckoning with my own sort of digital addictions over the course of many years, as well as sort of thinking about how the church is leveraging digital technology. So yeah, I think it's a confluence of just where I am, where I grew up, who I'm surrounded by, and trying to figure out what it means to follow Jesus faithfully in the midst of all of that.
Yeah, and I think just your proximity to where you're at does give a lot of people are thought leaders, I think, in this space, but your proximity to be in discipleship relationships with people that are producing and working, for some of these tech companies like Apple, it's just fascinating, and it gives you a point of view and proximity that, hey, here in the middle of the country, we just don't have, And so this isn't a question that I prepared you for, but we are in Nebraska, which is very far from Silicon Valley. Have you been to Nebraska?
I've never been to Nebraska. I have a friend in Omaha
Okay.
who's a pastor out there, but no, I've never been. Maybe one day I'd like to.
Yeah, I was just gonna see what your image, like, what do you think of Nebraska when you hear of it? So
I think of I think of Nebraska football, to be honest with you.
Oh,
I think
wow.
of the football team at the University of Nebraska. I like sports. Corn, is that a thing?
Yeah,
I'm making that up.
Corn Kid, right? That was famous a while ago on social media. So I'm
That's right.
impressed that Nebraska football even still is on the radar. I mean, I'm a diehard, but
Well, they were awesome when I was growing up.
Yeah,
I mean, I
me
don't think
too.
they're as awesome anymore, but
They're
yeah,
not.
So
We're on our way back, though, as we say every year.
okay.
Back into so the book that you wrote is called Analog Christian, and kind of the subtitle of it is Cultivating Contentment, Resilience, and Wisdom in the Digital Age. And so the book breaks down each of those three things, from cultivating contentment, cultivating resilience, and cultivating wisdom as you work through it. And so just in my brain, to kind of work through that way, we'll start with the idea of cultivating contentment and what you mean there. And one of the things that really stuck out to me as I'm reading this is you introduce a theme or a term called self-centric despair, which is kind of opposed to being self-centered. I think a lot of times we think of people being self-centered, or I'm trying to think of another word that we like to throw around. Narcissist, we like to, label everybody a narcissist these days. Help unpack just the difference in the nuance of an idea like self-centric and self-centered, and how that plays into cultivating contentment in our lives, especially when we get into the digital space.
Yeah, that's a great question. I specifically use the term self-centric despair because, to differentiate it, self-centric despair can include, I think, components of self-centeredness or narcissism for sure. And I think it often does in ways that we might not even recognize. But ultimately, self-centeredness is sort of a deep, desperate longing for the world and life to orbit and revolve around you in some form or fashion. Narcissism is this sort of incredibly high view of yourself, and that only exists in relation to other things and other people, right? You can only be a narcissist if there are others that you see with whom you can sort of rise above, choke, step on their necks, choke them so that I can like that's sort of narcissism. I think self-centric despair, at least as I intend to mean it, not only does it not require others, self-centric despair is almost the inability to truly see and recognize others, whether in healthy or unhealthy ways.
Yeah.
So by self-centric despair, I just mean like in a consistent, constant, relentless gaze inward. Not a desire necessarily to have everything orbit around me, but literally to live life looking just inside. Like what's happening in me, reality is that which is just internal right here, And the argument I'm trying to make is that in the digital age, whether we are aware of it or not, we have a significant self-centric despair problem. We think that we are connecting deeply with the world via the internet and our smartphones and social media. But if you look at all of the data and just consider your own human experience, what becomes pretty clear pretty fast is that the internet's promise and social media's promise of a beautiful, utopia of a global village has proven a farce. It's a lie. That's not what's happened. Levels of isolation and loneliness have increased exponentially, in particular since the advent of the smartphone. And most social scientists and social psychologists seem to agree now that that's not coincidental. And I'm not anti-technology. Sometimes people misunderstand and think I'm saying you should throw away all your digital devices or something. I'm not. I'm actually quite grateful for digital technology. It's just more so like we've got to be aware of what these technologies are doing to us instead of just thinking about what they're doing for us, because they are doing something to us, not just for us. They're forming us into a particular type of people. And if we're not aware of that, then that formation process can go haywire pretty quick.
Yeah. And I don't know if it was you or someone else, because I've just been steeped in this, prepping for our series that just talks about the human experience that God designed us for is of community. In the garden, like everything's good.
Yep. Right.
Except for man to be alone, and so I create community, and we have a communal God, obviously, in the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, that has always, so part of what being made in the image of God is to be wired for community. And it seems like in the digital age, it's easy to kind of scratch or put a Band-Aid on that need, or have the milk instead of the meat, as Paul would kind of describe it. And so I think it's fascinating as that idea of being self-centric is we have this illusion that we're maybe involved in more community or more connected than we actually are. And so I think that is fascinating.
Yep.
One of the things I love too about your portion on cultivating resilience, and I'd probably have you unpack a little bit about what you mean by cultivating resilience. But I love your idea of John 15. You talk about that in there, abiding, or you break down the original, language of making a home in Jesus, like that invitation of Jesus to say, "Abide in me." And you talk about we have a lack of patience in our society, and microwave culture and digital devices, all of that kind of creates this lack of patience inside of us. Talk more about the idea in John 15 and how that ties into our resiliency and just our lack of patience, and kind of obviously don't regurgitate the entire chapter, but kind of what's the heart of that there.
Yeah. John 15 is that famous passage about Jesus basically saying, like, I'm the vine, you are the branches, right? And he's talking about connectivity. So if you want your life to bear fruit, and all of us do, nobody's like, I hope my life is just sort of quite unfruitful and, leaves no lasting impact on the world. Most people, I think, are like, no, I would like to live a life that someone would categorize as a fruitful life, a life that had meaning and purpose, And so essentially, Jesus is using that metaphor of bearing fruit, and then he makes it really clear, like if you want your life to bear good fruit, the fruit that is born of the Spirit of God, then there's a way to do that. And it's not easy, but it's not complex. And essentially, he says the way to do that, to bear fruit, is for your life as a branch to stay connected to the vine. And he says, I am the vine, Jesus. So essentially, stay connected to me, like consistently, relentlessly stay connected to me, and do that for long enough, and your life will eventually and inevitably bear fruit, right? So to describe that, he basically says, the way I'm saying it, stay connected. The way he says it is essentially, I think one of the most beautiful English translations of it is a word we don't use much. It's the word you said. It's to abide, and it's a beautiful word, but we don't use it much today. It's not very popular in sort of like common nomenclature. But to abide is to stay connected, to linger, to dwell for a long time, for an extended period of time. In fact, the point you're making about what I say in the book, that word that's sometimes translated into the English word abide, it's a Greek word that is the verb tense, so the action tense of the Greek word for home. So basically, to abide is like to home, to make your home in Jesus. So this is different than go visit Jesus from time to time, or do a little Jesus time in the morning with your cup of coffee for about 5 to 7 minutes before you leave him behind in the kitchen and move on about your day. No, this is like make your home Jesus.
Yeah.
Wherever you go, wherever you are, And there's an interesting thing about home. Like right now I'm sitting in my office, so I'm not in my house. But in terms of being home, home is always with me in some form or fashion, right? When I think about home, I don't at least first and foremost think about 4 walls and a door and a bed or whatever. I think about my wife, and I think about our 2 young children, and I think about the beautiful life that we are creating together. And I think that is the invitation of Jesus. Make your home in me, right? That wherever you go, whatever you're doing, going about your day, work, school, parenting, whatever it might be, dinner with friends, anything, whatever it is you're doing, make your home in me, make sure that you anchor yourself on the reality that your life is in me and with me at all times. And I think, what he's saying is if you do that, then you will bear fruit. And there's an interesting thing. You're talking about resilience. And one of the suggestions I make in the book, essentially, big sort of overarching idea, is that resilience in the digital age in particular might very well look like patience and kindness and goodness in a culture of impatience and utter hostility. Like, can you be resilient enough to stand tall patiently with kindness and goodness, even as the rest of the world is just frantically moving about and totally hostile toward one another? And I think the only way that is possible is if we make our home in Christ, stay connected to him, and then the branches of our lives begin to bear the fruit of patience and kindness and goodness. And the last thing I'll say about it, one of the reasons why patience matters so much is like you can't microwave an orange, right? You can't get fruit overnight. You got to keep watering and pruning and tending to the soil, and then slowly over time, what you realize is, man, all the while, that entire time, there was life beneath the surface in the dirt that was sort of doing its work in ways that I didn't see. And, again, this is why I think abiding in Christ, making our home in Jesus, matters so much. And it's a slow and steady sort of patient work.
Yeah, and I mean, even throughout the narratives of Scripture, Old Testament, we love, I think, to fast forward stories, right? Jeremiah 29:11 is like this, I know the plans I have for you. We just finished a series at the church going through the book of Daniel, and it's like, okay, that was not microwaved. That prophetic word from Jeremiah was a lot of enduring and patience and character testing for fruit to be born in the life of Daniel and his friends. And so so many times Jacob, and a lot of scripture points towards that idea of we have to abide, continue to trust that there's going to be fruit. And I think that John 15, and to me, every time I read that, apart from me, you can do nothing. Like it just stops me in my tracks, because I don't think I live most days convinced of that. In a world chasing cloud of influence. So, so getting into the cultivating wisdom, chapter before just some basic questions is you tell a story about a coffee shop that's I think part of you guys' campus or church, the location there, and how you guys are next to a college and was often frequented by locals. You can correct any of this that I'm wrong. And I love one of the things you said here. Though our positions and perspectives remain different, our postures mirrored one another. So you talk about a conversation with a woman who was part of the LGBTQ IA community, and them wanting to boycott maybe the coffee shop because of finding out, hey, you guys are evangelical, and then tying all that stuff, and you felt really judged, and maybe some righteous anger in you, and you just kind of ended that story with the idea that your positions and perspectives, they remained different, but your postures mirrored one another. And for me, and part of our desire behind this podcast is that we live in a reality where, maybe everything we're not going to preach from the pulpit, but we want to get people in proximity to people's stories. And even though our positions aren't going to change about maybe a theological text or theology or a doctrinal statement, being in proximity to people changes our hearts towards people that God loves. And so for me, I just love that idea. And I've got a sibling who's part of who's transgender. And so just how you phrased that was so good. But can you tell maybe a little bit more of that story that I totally botched, and talk about how that
No, you didn't botch it.
How that helps in that idea of cultivating wisdom, and maybe lean more into that idea of your positions and perspective still remaining different, because I think especially in a world that's as divided as it's ever been in our culture, that idea of your postures mirroring one another.
Yeah, it's a story I tell in the book. It was while I was on staff at my previous church, which was in a town about 30 minutes south of where I am now, called Santa Cruz. And that church, still to this day, the church owns and operates a coffee shop. It's a open to the public coffee shop, 7 days a week. So it used to be open during Sunday services. So cool. The church and the coffee shop are also like a mile and a half down the road from UC Santa Cruz, University of California in Santa Cruz, which is arguably the most progressive liberal university in maybe the country, certainly in California. Our coffee shop was often frequented by students from the university, and we loved that. The coffee shop was there to serve the community and to just love them, not ask anything of them, but just love them and care for them and create a space for people to connect. And then one day, a young woman, a student at the university, who was actually a student leader in the university's LGBTQIA coalition group, student body coalition group, she somehow found something. She found something about our theological position on human sexuality. And she was appalled by this. She started a campaign to sort of shut down our coffee shop, said that it was run by a bigoted church that was a gay hate group, which we were not. We intentionally tried to serve not just the LGBTQIA community in our church, but in our city, but all sorts of people in our city. We really tried to do that and create a space where they didn't feel judged, but they felt loved and welcomed. Yeah. So we felt really misunderstood, and I was forwarded her email, so I emailed her back, and I was really angry, but I tried to send as gentle of an email as I could, and was really tempted to say some not so nice things, all of that. But basically, long story short, she and I decided to have coffee together, and something really pretty incredible happened when we had coffee. I mean, we just found common ground despite our positional differences. So it's not like she changed her mind on the position, and I didn't change my mind. But there is something really transformative that can happen where people can, we realize it's okay. Like, we are able to disagree and still be gentle toward one another, be kind, and honor and respect and uphold each other's humanity. What Christians would call the imago Dei, intrinsic in every human being. So I think that's a part of wisdom, especially in sort of outrage culture. I think that's a part of wisdom, is living gently when the world is raging on, and it's hard to do, but it's a really fruitful and freeing way to live life.
Yeah, I think that's so good. And there's just nothing. I think one of the things that digital is so much missing is proximity. I mean, you can be so proximate to someone and not be present, but there's just something different about, your senses being engaged with a real human and a real story, and not just a headline or a debate point or whatever. So cultivating wisdom in that is so good. And it's something that, especially I think in our digital world, outrage culture, as you mentioned, is something we have to get better at. There's an election coming, in case people didn't know, and these are all going to be ideas that are on the forefront and blasted all over, social media, whether you want to see it or not. And so, how do we cultivate wisdom there? Another idea that I picked up, I don't know if it was in the book or another podcast I was watching that you were talking about, was in cultivating wisdom, you talked about the difference between meaningless leisure and meaningful rest and Sabbath. And so I think in a digital space, in a digital world, a lot of maybe what we sit down to do and binge watch or things like that is like, hey, I'm just tired, I'm exhausted, I don't want to think, and I want to have just leisure. There's nothing inherently wrong about this. And I think in a culture, where to hell with the hustle and, some of those ideas of like, we need more rest and quiet quitting and so on and so forth are just a big part of it. And there is a laser focus outside of the church, even on just being restful and being people that have downtime and space to think, white noise, whatever buzzword you want to call it. Help set the difference, especially when we get into the digital talk about meaningless leisure and meaningful rest. And what do you see as the differences between those two ideas?
Yeah, the writer Andy Crouch, who I deeply love and respect, has been really kind to me. He's got a lot of work on this, so I think I'm probably those concepts I'm borrowing from him. But basically, as I understand it, not just from what people have written, but from my own experience, I think maybe there's a lot to say about it, and there's a whole sort of biblical theology about the concept of Sabbath and Sabbath rest and what that is and what that isn't. And I do think often it's sort of misunderstood. I think a lot of people, Christians, understand Sabbath as taking a break from hard work, and biblically speaking, it's not that. It's actually not that totally, but it's so much more than that. But I think generally speaking, meaningless leisure versus meaningful rest for me really comes down to it comes down to a couple things. One of the things I think about is I think meaningless leisure is in some form or fashion a sort of running away from the work, so that I can, detox from the toil of it or something. It's like, oh my gosh, Monday to Friday was so rough. I need to get away from that and veg out on my couch and just binge the Netflix show and eat terribly or whatever. Whereas meaningful rest, I think, is not running away from the toil and labor. It's actually a hopeful anticipation of the work that is to come and preparing ourselves for that work. But preparing for that work by putting the work in its rightful place, which is to say, whether I am here or not, whether this next breath is my last or I have decades more to go, the world and all that is in it belongs to God. And so I do not need to saddle myself with the pressure or anxiety of, the future of whatever hinges on my performance. It's a reminder, Abraham Joshua Heschel, the Hebrew, the Jewish rabbi, 20th century Jewish rabbi, he talks about the difference between the world of space or things and the world of time. And Sabbath, he says, is rest in the world of time. It's a gift, in that world. And I think that's one of the most powerful things about Sabbath is that when you are resting in the presence of God, you are reminded that time is ticking on the same exact way as it was when you were hustling on Thursday afternoon or whatever, and there's no amount of human intellect or ingenuity, no amount of work or creativity that the human being can exert that will stop time from marching on. And so Sabbath is a way to say, man, this world and all that is in it, it is not mine, and time does not belong to me either. And God, El Olam, which means everlasting God, right? That's kind of what Abraham calls God in Genesis 21, I think. It's a beautiful reminder, like God exists, he's everlasting, he exists outside of time. And so we rest, knowing that if we do not finish the work in our lifetimes, God's got forever and he'll get it done, sort of thing, So
good.
There you go. Yeah.
Do you see value in boredom? Because I think in this digital space,
I do.
It's like I think it's one of the things we automatically do. I think boredom, like standing in line, it's a fascinating how my kids, I've got 4 kids, 10 and under, and like a line at a drive-through or, a line in somewhere is like vastly different. It's like almost you have to be entertained and it's hard to find value sometimes or communicate value in boredom. How do you communicate that?
Yeah, I would totally agree. And I think it's not just that I see value in boredom. I think I'm alarmed at how anti-boredom we've become. And I actually think, I don't just think, there's been some research done on this. Our inability to wade into the waters of boredom are actually keeping us from tapping into our deepest wells of creativity and imagination.
Yeah.
There's been some recent research that has shown actually boredom is the pathway by which it's the path you take to reach the recesses of your deepest sort of creativity and imagination. So because we're all just sort of like scrolling TikTok all day, we think we're having a good time, but in reality, there are untapped mountains of creativity and imagination that are just lying dormant because our brains are just hardwired now neurologically to crave the sort of 30-second dopamine hit.
Yeah. And
that squelches the neurons that spark creativity and imagination. So, man, we could talk a long time about this. I think this poses a tremendous challenge for the future of any sort of creative work.
Yeah. Yeah. And it keeps people in the toilet longer, let's be honest, so bad potty joke. So let's move on. So how do you see the church? Because you live in a place like Silicon Valley, and Silicon's something totally different. And like you said, you're in a small group, you're in community and discipleship relationships with people working for Apple. And obviously, Google's kind of in that world. And it seems like they have seen a need for discipleship. I don't think they call it discipleship, but in this area, it's like, hey, we introduced the iPhone and all these devices, and then we see the destruction, we see the depression, anxiety, the lives being lost because of maybe not necessarily a brand, but because of the conglomeration of just digital devices. And so I know Apple's introduced this whole focus mode, and it was like a disciple, like as I watched the presentation on it, it's like a discipleship kind of idea. Same with Android's focus mode. Yep. They even call it a digital well-being tool. And so they have their eyes on, man, this isn't great for humans at the rate that we've accelerated it, and they're trying to help disciple well in that. And so as you have those conversations just with people maybe that you've talked to, how do you see them seeing this as a discipleship issue? Obviously they wouldn't call it that, but just a human conditioning issue. I don't know what the digital well-being issue that they would call it. What do those conversations look like for you as somebody who gets to be in proximity a little bit more to those people and conversations?
Yeah, I mean, one of the beautiful things is, and this might be anecdotal, so I don't have data to back this, and it might just be, sort of the people I talk to because they go to church and follow Jesus or something. I've been really pleasantly surprised. Now, I know this doesn't have necessarily like broad, wide impact in terms of how products are designed necessarily, but I've been really pleasantly surprised when I talk to people who work at Apple or Google, or we've got people who work at Meta, Facebook, and a bunch of startups. When I talk to them, there is actually a lot of thought given to, okay, what is this going to actually do to people? Like, we know what it's intended to do for people, but what is it going to do to people? And I think that conversation is growing, even internally, like within Silicon Valley, within these tech companies. It's an interesting thing about tech companies for a variety of reasons, but tech culture is a very aware culture. They're very aware of the conversations out there about them and about whatever. So maybe it's some of that. Maybe it's like PR type stuff. But generally, like I do hear a lot around that conversation that these companies are asking those conversations. Now, whether those conversations will lead to any sort of necessary wholesale changes so that we ensure technologies not completely devour our, emotional, mental well-being or something, I don't know. I don't know if it'll lead to that. But like you said, there are little things like focus mode and all these things where companies are beginning to at least try and create some parameters for health. But ultimately, I think at the end of the day, it just comes down to the person, like the 2 books I've written, they're not, people think they're about technology. They're not really about technology. Yeah. They're about humans. They're about human misuse or abuse of technology. And I think that's where we've got to start. People, we have to take ownership and responsibility for our actions, our addictions, and then ask God by His Spirit to free us from those things so that we can live free, liberated lives.
Yeah, so I imagine that obviously this book is a part of the conversation, to help us think about those things and help, inch the church forward in having these discipleship conversations. Because unfortunately, when I did student ministry for a long time, I know that was a part of your past. It was usually things that were tied to a device in some way connected to the internet that was messing with kids' lives more than car accidents or alcohol or drug. Of course, those were a part of it, but it's bullying. It's being ghosted. It's all those kinds of things that being broken up with and catfished. So how do you see the church? Like, what are some of the ways that the church needs to move forward and be proactive, with this instead of just reactive toward it? How can we continue to move the ball forward and leading the conversation in this, and not just trying to disciple people out of all their bad habits later in life that we've already been like, we just let those people deal with it that are experts. And sometimes the church does need to do that because we've dabbled in things we shouldn't. But how do you see that discipleship coming from the church on these devices? How do you guys do it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm wary of ever giving a lot of how-tos because I think so much of it is contextual. So I just know my church, So maybe the best thing I could share is just kind of how we try to approach it here. So one, we try to inform as much as possible. I think so many of the issues, they begin at an utter lack of awareness. I think so many people are just like, I think the number is increasing, which I'm really happy and hopeful about, but I still think so many people sort of think that the little black box in their back pocket, called the smartphone, is just a neutral, it's just a neutral entity. it's really not.
Yeah.
If it's a smartphone and you have the internet on it, and especially if you have social media on it, that little machine is not neutral. It desires something not for you, it desires something from you. And what it desires from you is, honestly, it's total, utter, blind allegiance and addiction and devotion. Now, there is a way to navigate that without throwing the phone out, and it's to sort of create boundaries and parameters by which you're going to function in a healthy way. And there's practical ways to do that. So I think it begins with informing people. And then, two, I think primarily, this is true for all things in life, I don't think humans are primarily motivated by fear. I think they're motivated primarily by desire. So informing people and saying, man, digital technology will just ruin your life if you let it, and raising that awareness through all the dangers, I think some of that's really important, but I don't know that will really change a life. I think what we've got to do is help people rehabituate their desires, that their desire to scroll social media is replaced by a desire for real community and connection in a deep, meaningful way with one another, and so on and so forth. So, rehabituating desires instead of just trying to, scare them into change, I think is an important piece.
Yeah, I think it is the liturgies. That thought makes me go to James K. Smith and, you are what you love. And there's so much depth into that idea of the liturgies that we're creating unknowingly, but that are shaping our hearts. And I think another part of it is we're digital immigrants, and then there's digital natives. And I don't know, my parents didn't have to navigate this. My kid's 10 and he wants an iPhone, and for totally different reasons than my mom and dad want an iPhone for. My parents are like, hey, I've got a calculator and a phone and my calendar and Rolodex. It's all in one. I don't have to carry a bag around anymore. And, so we just have different desires and things that we see out of this tool. But like you said, I have your book sitting right here. It hasn't vibrated and asked for my attention yet, like my phone has during this, if I wouldn't have moments off. And so I think as a church, we have to realize some of that, and that we're speaking culturally, generationally, some different languages. And we have to be honest about that and say, okay, we're coming from two different worlds. How do we continue to have those conversations? So a couple other just quick questions. What do you think because people, like you've even said, people labeled you as somebody maybe anti-tech or, and then there's people that are pro-tech. And what do you think draws us to want to make those labels, about people, to read read just the title of your book and they're like, okay, yeah, this guy, he's one of those weirdos that thinks this is all bad, and he's not actually going to reach anybody, and then because this is the new highway and the new Roman road and all that kind of stuff. What do you think drives people to want to make put people in those camps, I guess?
There's probably a lot to that. I think some of it is this thing in psychology called motive attribution asymmetry. It's like a long, fancy way of saying, basically, we think of ourselves as really complex, nuanced people, and then we just totally oversimplify other people.
Sure.
So I know that I am really deep and nuanced, and it's not really black and white. There's a lot going on. But then when I see somebody else, I'm like, oh, it must be this, like we just really oversimplify, and we attribute particular motives to people that sort of fit within our paradigm of what we think is true or untrue. Excuse me. So my guess is something like that is happening, and I'm sure there's a lot more. I don't take it personally. I mean, I've probably done the same, sort of looked at the cover or the title or subtitle of a book and thought, oh yeah, I bet I know what they're going to say or whatever. So I totally get it. But yeah, it's a good question. But my guess is something like that, yeah.
I know you talk about smoking, and kind of use that analogy, cigarettes, and kind of the how we've moved forward as a society. Do you think social media or just the tech company, they're just the target, for the scapegoat for why our society is falling apart, and it's just, hey, we need somebody to put the blame on, and so we're just going to blame them. But it's and obviously there's probably nuance to this. So some of these are questions people are like, hey, I'd love you to ask him. So do you think that it's just the Apple, Google, social media, it's just the scapegoat for, the unraveling of our society, or something deeper, or a little both?
Well, I think that's a complex question. I don't think it's as simple as saying
Yes.
it's social media's fault or it's not their fault. Yeah, I said it earlier. Social media in particular, it's not neutral. That is for sure. Inherent in the design, inherent in its algorithms is an intention. The business model is built on retaining our attention, so it's not it's not neutral. At the same time, while there are obviously significant addictive elements to social media, at the end of the day, nobody is forcing you to download Instagram. Now, I know it feels like, but Jay, how could I possibly live?
Yeah.
My wife has not had any social media for several years, and she's happier than she ever was when she had a Twitter and an Instagram account. It is possible. And then there's the whole but then how will I know what's happening in anybody's life? My wife has not struggled with that. Yeah, she doesn't know what her high school classmate from 16 years ago is doing out in New Jersey right now. Yeah. But she doesn't do life with that person anyways, And if she really wanted, she could email her or text, and it's fine. So, yeah, those excuses are pretty flimsy. So nobody's making you use these apps. I understand they're deeply addictive. So I share all of that to say it's hard to say, well, it's this person's fault or it's that entity's fault. I think it's a complex sort of nexus web of chaos. And I think the best we can do is ask the question, well, God, what do I need to change in my life so that you, by your Spirit, can, cultivate fruit in me in ways that you desire and that I really desire.
Oh, that's annoying. That takes so much more work than just being able to, blame shift or say it's something else.
Right.
This has all been helpful. And obviously, and that's one of the things I have loved and admired about, this book. I'm kind of going backwards, and then I'll read Analog Church. But is that it's not so much about the nuts and bolts of tech, but it starts with our identity, in the beginning, and being beloved and seeing ourselves as that. And man, that's such a core need for most people, whether you care about tech or not, whether you're in on this debate or not. Like for me, it blessed my soul and reminded me, I get to preach that all the time, but sometimes I need to be reminded from an outside voice, that I am beloved, and that's where my identity does lie, and that's the life. That's what bears fruit in my life, and so just grateful for just your voice in this cultural moment, and how you've ministered, to me, and it's going to be definitely a resource we'll point people to in our series and in our kind of resource page here. But are there other ideas or resources that you're like, hey, I'd point you to this or that, things that you found helpful in the journey?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. So much. Yeah. I mentioned him already, but Andy Crouch wrote a book several years ago called The Tech-Wise Family, but his newest book, which came out recently, called The Life We're Looking For, that book I would highly, highly recommend. If you're interested sort of in some of these things. Yeah, and then there's, non-Christian thinkers that have been really influential for me.
We'll just
going back, sort of.
I'm totally kidding.
Going back to maybe like the 80s, Neil Postman, obviously, Amusing Ourselves to Death is like a seminal book when it comes. It's pre-digital age, but
almost prophetic.
So important along. Not almost, completely prophetic. Yeah, completely prophetic. Like you would read it, and if you didn't know he wrote it in the 80s, you would just think he was talking about the internet. It's
crazy.
Wild. Marshall McLuhan, and then more contemporary people that have been really helpful for me are Sherry Turkle, Adam Alter, Gene Twenge, Jaron Lanier, Nicholas Carr, Cal Newport. I think Cal Newport's very well known now. He wrote a book called Deep Work years ago that went wild. So yeah, tons of great resources out there about the digital age and about what it's doing to us, for sure.
Awesome. Well, thanks again for your time, everybody. Thank you for listening to today's podcast. If you've got questions or comments, you can always email us podcast@cccomaha.org. You can also find us on Instagram at CCCOMA podcast, or leave us a voicemail. We love to answer those each week. And so until next time, we'll see you then.